The wheel gave way with a crack that seemed to split the whole cliff road in two, and for one suspended heartbeat nobody moved at all. Then the carriage lurched sideways, groaning on its axle, and the child's scream rose above the wind coming off the sea. Eleanor Ashworth did not think. She was already running before the coachman had thrown himself clear, before the horses had begun their frantic, dangerous dance at the very edge of the drop, before the girl's governess had even risen from where she had been flung against the rocks. Eleanor's boots found the gravel and held, though the whole path seemed to tilt beneath her, though the wind tried to take her skirts and throw her into the gorse. She had walked this cliff road every week of her life since she was a girl herself, carrying baskets of mending down to the harbour cottages, and she knew where the stone was solid and where it crumbled to nothing, knew it the way she knew her own hands. The little girl had been thrown from the open door of the carriage, and had caught, by some mercy that Eleanor would later think of as the only kindness fate showed that morning, on a jut of rock no wider than a windowsill. Below her the cliff fell away in grey folds toward water the colour of iron, and the child's fingers were already slipping, her small shoes scrabbling for purchase against stones slicked with mist. "Hold to me," Eleanor called, and dropped to her knees at the very lip of the path, reaching down with both arms even as loose stones skittered past her, and vanished into the gulf below. "Look at me, not at the water. Look at me." The girl's face turned up to her, white with terror, dark curls plastered to her forehead with sweat and rain. She could not have been more than 7. I can't hold you can," Eleanor said, and her voice did not shake, though everything else in her did. "You are holding now. You have held this long already. Give me your hand." She stretched until her shoulder screamed and her stays cut into her ribs, until the whole weight of her body hung forward over nothing, held only by the strength of her own knees, pressed into wet stone, and the sheer stubbornness that had carried her through harder things than this. The girl's fingers found hers, cold, so cold, and shaking, and Eleanor closed her hand around that small wrist, as though she meant never in her life to let go of anything again. "I have you," she said. "I have you now." She did not know, in that moment, that the man scrambling down the slope toward her, his hat lost somewhere in the gorse, his fine grey coat torn at the shoulder, was the Duke of Wrenfield. She knew only that he was shouting something she could not hear over the wind, that he reached them just as she hauled the child up over the last treacherous foot of rock, and into her arms, both of them collapsing back onto the safer stone of the road in a tangle of skirts and gravel and gasping breath. For a moment, no one spoke. The girl clung to Eleanor's neck with the fierce, mindless grip of a creature who has just understood, all at once, what it is to nearly die, and Eleanor held her back just as fiercely, murmuring the kind of nonsense one murmurs to frightened children, that it was over now, that she was safe, that the sea could not have her. Then the man was on his knees beside them, and Eleanor saw his face properly for the first time, lined with a fear so raw it looked almost like grief already arrived, though the worst had not happened. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the kind of bearing that spoke of command even in disarray, even with mud on his knees and his cravat torn loose at his throat. "Sophia." His voice broke on the single word. He gathered the child from Eleanor's arms with hands that trembled, pressing his mouth to the crown of her head, and for several long seconds he could not speak at all. The coachman had by now got the horses quieted, though the carriage itself listed dangerously on its broken wheel, one side of it hanging half over the drop. The governess sat some yards off, weeping into her hands, a cut above her eyebrow bleeding freely into her collar. It was, Eleanor understood only now, that her own heart had begun to slow its frantic hammering. A very near thing indeed. Had the rock shelf been narrower, had she been 30 seconds later coming round the bend with her basket of mending, had the wind chosen that moment to gust instead of hold, She got to her feet unsteadily, brushing gravel from her palms, aware all at once of how she must look, her hair come loose from its pins, her old wool dress torn at the hem, her hands scraped raw. She had not thought, in the running and the reaching, of how she looked. She thought of it now, with the man's eyes suddenly upon her, dark and searching, as though he were trying to memorize her face. "You are hurt," he said. "It is nothing." She glanced at her palms. "Scratches only. The child is she. She is safe. Because of you." He rose, still holding the girl against his shoulder, and Eleanor saw now the fineness of his ruined coat, the signet ring on the hand that cradled his daughter's head, and understood, with a small cold drop of feeling in her stomach, that this was no ordinary gentleman come to grief on the cliff road. "I do not know your name." "Eleanor Ashworth, sir, of the village below." She dropped a small, awkward curtsy, made stranger by the fact that her hands still shook, and her hem was torn nearly to the knee. "I was only passing. Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said, and something in his voice made her look up at him properly. "They would not. I have seen men freeze at lesser danger than this." I froze myself. For the half-second it took me to understand what I was seeing, and that half-second might have been the whole of it, might have been everything, if you had not already been running. He drew a breath that shuddered on its way out. "You did not freeze at all." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to being looked at as though she had done something remarkable. She had grown up the daughter of a schoolmaster who died young, and a mother who took in mending to keep them fed, and there was little room in such a life for anyone to remark upon her at all, let alone a man who was, she understood now with mounting certainty, someone of very great consequence. "Your daughter needs warmth and rest, sir," she said instead, practical as she had always been in the face of things too large to feel all at once. "And the governess wants tending. That cut will want stitching, I think, or at least a clean binding. Is there a house near where you might send for help?" "Wrenfield Hall is 3 miles distant." He said it simply, as though the name should mean something to her, and perhaps it ought to have, though Eleanor had lived her whole life in the shadow of the great house on the headland, without ever once seeing beyond its gates. "But the carriage cannot be moved, and I do not like to leave my daughter's side to walk for aid." "Then I will go," Eleanor said. "I know a shorter way, along the sheep track above the orchard wall. It will save you the better part of a mile. I can send my brother with the pony cart within the hour." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face she could not read. Not quite disbelief, not quite gratitude, but some tangled thing between the two, as though he was recalculating, in that moment, everything he had assumed about the shape of the world and the people who moved through it. "I would be forever in your debt," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing, sir. I did only what any Christian soul would do." She was already turning to go, already reaching for the sensible, ordinary business of fetching help, because it was easier than standing beneath that dark, searching gaze a moment longer. But his voice caught her before she had gone 3 steps. "Miss Ashworth." She turned back. "I will not forget this," he said, and though he was still holding his daughter close against his shoulder, still pale with the fright of what had so nearly happened, there was something in the way he said it that told her he meant it not as a courtesy, but as a vow. She did not know, walking away along the sheep track with her heart still unsteady and her palms stinging, that those words would prove the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. The pony cart brought the girl and her governess down to the village within the hour, and Eleanor's brother Thomas, red-faced and out of breath from the running, reported that the gentleman had insisted on walking the whole 3 miles beside the cart, rather than leave his daughter's side, his ruined coat still damp with mist, his hand resting the entire way upon the child's small shoulder, as though he feared the wind itself might yet try to take her. It was 2 days before Eleanor learnt his name properly, though half the village had already guessed it. The Duke of Wrenfield had been a recluse these 5 years, since his wife's death, seen rarely beyond his own gates. His grief a thing the village spoke of in hushed and respectful tones, the way one speaks of a wound that has never quite closed. His daughter, Lady Sophia, was his only child, and by every account the whole of what remained to him of joy in the world. It was old Mrs. Pratt at the bakehouse who told her, wide-eyed with the drama of it, that a rider had come down from the hall that very morning asking after the Ashworth cottage, and Eleanor felt something turn over in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. Not quite fear, not quite anticipation, but some cousin to both. The letter came that afternoon, sealed with wax, and addressed in a hand so fine and certain that Eleanor's mother, who could read but slowly, made her read it aloud twice before she would believe it. It was an invitation. No, she corrected herself, reading it a third time alone in the small room she shared with her younger sister. It was scarcely even a request. The Duke of Wrenfield wished to extend his household's gratitude in person, and hoped Miss Ashworth might do them the honour of calling at the hall, at whatever hour suited her, so that his daughter, who had asked for her, he wrote 3 times already, and would not be easy until she had seen her rescuer with her own eyes and thanked her properly, might have the chance to do so. Eleanor, read that particular line 4 times. She has asked for you 3 times already, and will not be easy until she has seen you. There was, beneath the courtesy of it, something almost plaintive in the words, as though the Duke himself understood that his daughter's fright had left a mark that only Eleanor's presence might smooth away, and that he, for all his rank and consequence, could not smooth it himself. "You must go, of course," her mother said, folding the letter with hands gone a little unsteady with the strangeness of the thing. A duke's letter, in their small cottage, addressed to her own daughter. One does not refuse a duke, Eleanor, whatever the reason for the asking. "I know it," Eleanor said, though something in her chest had gone tight and watchful, at the thought of walking through those great gates she had passed 1,000 times, and never once entered. "I only wonder what it is he thinks he owes me, that a letter and a thank you would not settle." Her mother looked at her, with the particular expression she wore when she thought her daughter was being deliberately obtuse. "He owes you his daughter's life, child. Some debts a letter does not settle at all." She went the following morning, in her good grey dress with the collar her mother had trimmed fresh the night before, walking the long way round by the main road, because she could not, in her nervousness, quite bring herself to take the shorter path past the cliff, where the wheel had broken. The gates of Wrenfield Hall stood open when she arrived, as though she had been expected and watched for, and a footman in blue livery met her before she had gone 20 steps up the drive, bowing with a formality that made her want to laugh from sheer disbelief at her own circumstances. The hall itself was larger than she had imagined, even having grown up in its shadow, grey stone softened by age and ivy, its windows catching the pale morning light, gardens laid out in the old formal style behind low box hedges, gone slightly wild with neglect, as though no one had had the heart to tend them properly in some years. She was shown not to a formal drawing-room, as she had half expected and dreaded, but out to a small sunny terrace at the rear of the house, where Lady Sophia sat wrapped in a shawl, despite the mildness of the day, a bandage still visible at her wrist where she had scraped it against the rock, and beside her, the Duke. The moment Sophia saw her, the child was on her feet and running, careless of decorum, and flung her small arms around Eleanor's waist with such force that Eleanor nearly staggered. "You came," Sophia said, muffled against her skirts. "I told Papa you would come. I told him you would not forget me." "I could never forget you," Eleanor said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was entirely true, that the child's face had stayed with her these 2 days. vivid as a burn, and that some part of her had thought of little else. She crouched down to the girl's height, smoothing the dark curls back from her forehead. "And how is your wrist? Does it pain you still?" "Only a little. Papa says I am very brave." "You are very brave," Eleanor agreed. "You did not scream after the first moment, and you held on when I told you to. And that was no small thing for a girl of 7 to manage." Sophia beamed at that, the particular unguarded joy of a child who has been frightened and is now, in the safety of daylight and a familiar face, allowed to feel proud instead. Eleanor rose again, and found the Duke watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something quieter than the raw fear she had seen on the cliff road, something that unsettled her rather more. "Miss Ashworth," he said, rising as well, with the careful courtesy of a man unused, perhaps, to receiving guests of any consequence lower than his own rank, and uncertain, in this instance, quite how to bridge the gap between what he owed her and what propriety allowed him to offer. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit, there is tea, if you will take it." She sat, feeling the strangeness of the fine chair beneath her, the delicate china set before her, the whole unfamiliar ceremony of it, while Sophia settled herself at Eleanor's elbow with the proprietary satisfaction of a child who has decided, without consulting anyone, that a new and important attachment has been formed and is not to be questioned. "I have thought a great deal these 2 days," the Duke said, "about what I might do to properly repay what you did. I confess I have not settled on anything that feels adequate to the debt." "There is no debt, sir," Eleanor said again, as she had said on the cliff road, though she suspected by now that repeating it would do little to convince him. "I would ask nothing of you." "That," he said, with the faint ghost of a smile, the first she had seen on his face, "is precisely why I find myself so at a loss. A man who wished for reward would be simple to satisfy. A woman who wishes for nothing is a far greater puzzle." Sophia, uninterested in the adult conversation happening over her head, tugged at Eleanor's sleeve. "Will you come again? Papa says I may have you to visit if you are willing. I want to show you the orchard, and the pond where the swans nest, and my pony, whose name is Juniper, and Sophia," the Duke said. Gently, but with the note of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "You must not press Miss Ashworth. She has a life of her own, and duties, and cannot spend her days entertaining a small girl's whims." But something in the child's face, hopeful and uncertain all at once, the fear of the cliff road still not entirely gone from her, needing. Eleanor understood with a mother's instinct she had not known she possessed, some proof that the world had not become entirely unsafe, moved Eleanor more than any argument the Duke himself might have made. "I should like to come again," she said, and meant it, "if your father permits it." The Duke's eyes met hers over his daughter's dark head, and something passed between them that was not quite spoken, not quite acknowledged, but understood all the same. Gratitude, yes, but something else beginning to take root beside it, tentative and unexamined. "He permits it," the Duke said quietly. "He permits it gladly." It began, in that way, as visits, once a week, then twice, Eleanor walking the long road up to Wrenfield Hall with a basket of small things for Sophia. A book of fairy stories, a length of ribbon, once a kitten from the litter born in the Ashworth's own barn, which Sophia named Storm, and loved with the whole undivided passion of a child's heart. The Duke was present at first only at the edges of these visits, watching from some distance as his daughter and the schoolmaster's daughter grew easy and laughing with one another. But as the weeks passed, he found himself drawn closer, until it became his habit to walk with them in the orchard, or to sit near while Eleanor read aloud, his own book forgotten open on his knee. He was not, Eleanor came to understand, the cold and forbidding figure the village gossip had painted him as in his years of seclusion. He was a man who had loved his wife with a depth that had nearly broken him when he lost her, and who had spent the years since in a kind of careful, dutiful grief, going through the motions of his position, while some essential warmth in him lay banked and untended, like a fire kept alive only enough not to go entirely out. His daughter was the one flame he had allowed himself to tend properly, and in tending her, Eleanor began to see he had forgotten how to tend anything, including himself. "You laugh so rarely," she said to him once, on an autumn afternoon when Sophia had run ahead of them chasing Storm through the fallen leaves, "that when you do, I confess it startles me rather more than it ought." I had forgotten the sound of my own laughter, he admitted, and there was no self-pity in it, only a plain, weary honesty. Sophia's mother had a gift for it, for finding what was worth laughing at, even in dull hours. I have not had that gift myself, not since she died. But you have something of it. You find the small good things others walk past. "It is not a gift," Eleanor said. "It is only that I have not had the luxury of dwelling long on what is hard. My mother needed me cheerful for her own sake when my father died. Sophia needs the same, I think, though for different reasons. And what do you need?" he asked, and the question, quiet and unguarded, caught her entirely by surprise. She did not answer at once. They had come to the low stone wall at the orchard's edge, where the land fell away toward the sea, visible in a grey glittering line beyond the hills, and she found herself looking at that instead of at him, because his eyes had grown too searching, too warm, for her to meet them just then. "I do not know that anyone has asked me that before," she admitted at last. "I have needed, mostly, to be useful, to be depended upon. It is a smaller thing to need than what you might imagine, sir." "It is not smaller," he said. "It is only quieter. I think it may be the largest thing of all, to wish to be needed truly, and not merely tolerated." She looked at him then, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and for a moment, only a moment, the whole careful distance they had maintained between them, Duke and schoolmaster's daughter, seemed a very thin and foolish thing indeed. But the moment did not last. Sophia's voice came calling from among the trees, bright and urgent with some small discovery, and the Duke stepped back, and the distance reasserted itself, as it always did, as it was always going to. Eleanor reminded herself sternly on the long walk home. He was the Duke of Wrenfield. She was the daughter of a dead schoolmaster, mending linens to help feed her mother and sister. Whatever warmth had grown between them in the orchards and terraces of the great house, it could not survive the walk back down to the village, where the world remembered precisely who she was, and was not. It was not long before the village began to remember it for her, aloud and often. She had not thought, at first, that her visits to the hall would draw much notice. The village had 100 small dramas to occupy its attention, and she was, after all, only calling upon a frightened child who had asked for her. But as the autumn wore into winter, and her visits grew more frequent, and it became known that she had twice now taken tea with the Duke himself upon the terrace, the whispers began, first at the well, then at church, then most painfully from the mouth of Mrs. Colber, the vicar's wife, who cornered her after service one grey Sunday with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You are becoming quite the fixture up at the hall, Miss Ashworth. One wonders what you imagine will come of it." "I imagine nothing will come of it beyond what already has," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level though her cheeks had gone hot. "I am fond of Lady Sophia. That is the whole of the matter." "Is it?" Mrs. Colbert's eyebrows rose with a delicacy that was somehow more cutting than open scorn would have been. "A duke does not take tea with a mending woman's daughter merely for his own child's sake, my dear, whatever you tell yourself. Men of his rank are not in the habit of forgetting themselves so far, unless there is something to be gained by it that has nothing to do with charity. I would not wish to see you disappointed, that is all. Or worse." The words followed her home like a cold draught under a door, and settled somewhere in her chest that would not warm again for days. It was not that she believed Mrs. Colbert. She did not think the Duke a man who trifled, whatever the woman implied. But the shape of the accusation troubled her precisely because it named something she had not yet allowed herself to look at directly, that whatever grew between herself and the Duke of Wrenfield, however innocent its beginnings in a frightened child's gratitude, could not end anywhere respectable. A duke did not marry a schoolmaster's daughter. The gap between them was not a matter of feeling but of law, of custom, of the whole ordered structure of the world she had been born into, and no amount of tenderness on an orchard wall would alter it. She resolved, walking home that Sunday with her jaw set, and her eyes stinging with a cold she told herself came only from the wind, to visit the hall less often, to let the attachment, whatever its true name, cool quietly before it could do either of them any harm. It was a resolution she kept for exactly 9 days, until a rider came pounding down the village road at dusk, with his horse in a lather, asking after her by name, saying that Lady Sophia had taken a fever in the night and would not be comforted, would not take her medicine, would not stop asking for Miss Ashworth between fits of coughing that frightened the whole household half to death. Eleanor did not stop to consider propriety, or Mrs. Colbert's warnings, or anything at all beyond the plain fact that a child she loved was frightened and ill and asking for her. She was on the pony cart within 10 minutes, her mother's shawl thrown over her shoulders against the cold, and did not draw an easy breath until she had climbed the stairs of Wrenfield Hall 2 at a time and come into the sick room, where Sophia lay flushed and restless against her pillows, her small chest working hard with every breath. And the Duke sat beside the bed with a face gone grey with fear he was clearly fighting to master for his daughter's sake. "Eleanor," Sophia said, the moment she saw her, and reached out a hand that trembled with fever. "You came. I knew you would come. Of course I came." Eleanor took the small, hot hand in both of hers and sat down at once upon the edge of the bed, careless of how it must look, careless of everything except the child's frightened eyes. "I am here now. You must be brave a little longer, and let the doctor's medicine do its work, and I will stay until you are well again." The physician came and went twice through that long night, and the fever broke only toward dawn, the crisis passing in the grey hour, when hope is hardest to hold and easiest to lose. Eleanor did not leave the bedside once, bathing the child's forehead with cool cloths, singing under her breath the same half-remembered lullabies her own mother had sung to her. And it was near 4 in the morning, with Sophia finally sleeping quietly, and the worst of the danger past, that she looked up and found the Duke watching her across the small space of the bed, with an expression that undid, in a single look, every careful resolution she had made to keep her distance. "You did not have to come," he said quietly, "so as not to wake his daughter. You had every right to refuse. It was late and improper, and I sent for you without thinking of what it might cost you, in the village, to be seen coming to the hall at such an hour." "I did not think of it either," Eleanor admitted. "I thought only that she was frightened, and that I could not bear for her to be frightened alone." "That is precisely it," he said, and his voice had gone rough with something he was clearly struggling to master, sitting there in the candlelight with his cravat long since discarded, and his hair disordered from the hours of sleepless worry. "You do not think of yourself at all when someone you love is in danger. I have watched you do it twice now, once on the cliff road, and now here, tonight, and I find I can no longer pretend to myself that what I feel for you is merely gratitude." Eleanor's breath caught. "Your Grace, Alexander," he said, "you have earned the right to my name, I think, after tonight, whatever the world would say of it." "The world would say a great deal," she said low, "if it knew you sat in your daughter's sick room confessing such things to a mending woman's daughter." "The world," he said, "may say what it likes. I have spent 5 years letting the world's opinion govern every part of my life that grief had not already claimed, and I find, watching you tonight, that I am tired of it, tired of being careful, tired of measuring every warmth I feel against what is proper, until there is nothing left of feeling at all but ash." He reached across the narrow space and took her hand, the one knot still curled around his sleeping daughter's fingers, and held it as though it were something precious and easily lost. "I do not ask you to answer me tonight. I ask only that you not pretend, any longer, that there is nothing here worth naming." She did not pull her hand away. That, perhaps, was answer enough for the both of them, in the exhausted, tender hour before dawn, with the child sleeping safely between them, and the whole ordered world outside the window not yet awake to judge what passed in that quiet room. But the world woke soon enough, as it always does. It was Sophia's own recovery, ironically, that brought the trouble to its head. Once well again, the child could not be persuaded to keep the closeness of that night private. She spoke of it to the housekeeper, to the nursemaid, to anyone who would listen, that Papa had held Miss Ashworth's hand all through her fever, and had called her by his given name, and had looked at her the way Sophia remembered him once looking at Mamma, before Mamma went away to heaven. Servants talk, whatever their loyalty, and within a fortnight the whole village had it, embellished, distorted, but essentially damningly true, that the Duke of Wrenfield had taken up with the schoolmaster's daughter, and meant, some said, to make her his mistress, if not worse, to disgrace the memory of his late wife entirely, by elevating a woman of no birth and no fortune to a place she had no right to occupy. Eleanor bore the whispers as long as she could, keeping her chin high at market, refusing to answer Mrs. Colbert's pointed inquiries. But it was her own mother's quiet, worried face across the supper table that finally broke something loose in her. "They are saying cruel things of you, Eleanor," her mother said one evening, not looking up from her mending. "I have heard it at the well, and at church, and I confess I do not know how to answer it, because I do not know myself what is true and what is idle gossip. Is there an understanding between you and the Duke?" "I do not know what there is," Eleanor said honestly, and found, to her own surprise, that her eyes had filled with tears she had not given herself permission to shed until that moment. "I know that I have come to care for him more than I ought, and for Sophia as though she were my own, and that none of it can come to anything, whatever he says in the quiet of a sick room at 4 in the morning. He is a duke, mother. I am nothing at all beside him, in the eyes of the world that will judge his choice of wife." "You are not nothing," her mother said sharply, setting down her needle. "You saved that child's life with your own 2 hands, at the risk of your own. You have sat with her through a fever no less than her own mother would have done. Whatever the world says of birth and fortune, it cannot say that you have not proven your worth 100 times over, in the ways that ought to matter most." "Ought," Eleanor said, "and does, are very different words, mother, in a world such as ours." It was the Duke himself who forced the matter into the open, some days later, in a manner Eleanor had not anticipated, and could not, afterward, have wished undone, however painful its beginning proved. He came to the village directly, unannounced, riding down from the hall in broad daylight with no pretense of secrecy at all, and walked into the Ashworths' small cottage with his hat in his hands, and an expression of such grim determination that Eleanor's mother, opening the door to him, nearly dropped her mending basket in surprise. "Miss Ashworth," he said. When Eleanor came to the door herself, her hands still damp from the washing, her hair coming loose from its pins, in a manner that would have mortified her a month before, and now seemed, somehow, beside the point entirely. "I have come to speak with you plainly, before the whole village if need be, because I find I can no longer bear to have my intentions whispered of in corners, as though they were something shameful. Your Grace, you must not. The whole street is watching. Let them watch." His voice carried, deliberate and clear, and Eleanor saw, over his shoulder, that several of their neighbours had indeed paused in their doorways and their errands, drawn by the sight of the Duke's fine horse tethered at so humble a gate. "I have spent 5 years of my life governed by what the world watches and what it says, and it cost me nothing but a slow, careful death of everything in me that once knew how to feel. I will not spend the rest of my years the same way. You saved my daughter's life on a cliff road in a storm, Miss Ashworth, without a moment's thought for your own safety, and you have loved her since with a tenderness I have not seen matched by anyone save her own mother. God rest her. And somewhere in the watching of that, I have come to love you myself, not out of gratitude, though I owe you that 100 times over, but because you are the finest, bravest, truest woman I have ever known, of whatever birth, and I find I do not care one whit what my rank is supposed to require of my choices. Eleanor stood frozen in her own doorway, aware distantly of her mother's hand coming to rest, trembling, upon her shoulder, aware of the whole street gone quiet and watchful around them, aware most of all of the Duke of Wrenfield standing bare, headed in the mud of the village lane, waiting. "You cannot mean to say this here," she managed at last. "Before everyone, I mean precisely that," he said. "I would not have them whisper behind their hands what I am not ashamed to say aloud. I am asking you, Eleanor Ashworth, in front of God, and this entire village, if you will consent to be my wife. Not my mistress, not some quiet arrangement to be hidden from polite company, but my wife, and Sophia's mother in truth as well as in her own affection, which she gave you long before I found the courage to give you mine." The silence that followed felt to Eleanor like the silence of the cliff road itself, that suspended heartbeat before the wheel gave way, except that this time she understood. Whatever broke or held in the next moment would determine the whole shape of the rest of her life. "They will never accept it," she said quietly, though her heart was hammering with something that was no longer only fear. "Your peers, your family, the whole of society that governs a man in your position. They will say you have disgraced yourself, disgraced your first wife's memory, disgraced Sophia's inheritance by marrying so far beneath your rank. Let them say it," he said. "I have buried one wife already, Eleanor, and I have learned, at great cost, that the opinion of society weighs nothing at all against the plain truth of what a man knows in his own heart to be right. I would rather live the whole of my remaining years as a subject of gossip, married to a woman I love and trust utterly, than live one more year as I have lived these 5 past. Correct, respectable, and entirely alone." Eleanor felt the tears come then, unstoppable, and found she did not care who saw them fall. "I love you," she said, the words coming out rough and unpolished. Nothing like the careful, composed answer she might have given if she had had time to plan it. "I have loved you, I think, since the night Sophia's fever broke, though I would not let myself name it, because I could not bear the disappointment of wanting something I believed I could never have. But I will not marry you to spite the world, Alexander. I will marry you, because I cannot any longer imagine my life without you and Sophia both in it." He crossed the small distance between them in 3 strides, and took her face in his 2 hands, careless of the mud on his boots and the whole village watching, and kissed her there in the lane with a tenderness that spoke of 5 long years of banked and careful grief finally, gently, coming undone. The wedding, when it came that spring, was smaller and quieter than Wrenfield Hall had seen in a generation, for the Duke's grander relations mostly declined to attend. Exactly as Eleanor had feared, and exactly as he had promised her, did not matter in the least. But the village turned out entire. From Mrs. Colbert, her earlier scorn quite forgotten, or at least conveniently unremembered, in the face of so fine an occasion, to old Mrs. Pratt from the bakehouse, who wept openly through the whole ceremony, and declared to anyone who would listen that she had always known, from the very first telling of the tale, that Eleanor Ashworth was destined for something remarkable. Sophia stood at the front of the small chapel in a dress of pale blue, scattering flower petals with the solemn, joyful concentration of a child performing the single most important task of her life, And when the vows were spoken and the ring given, she was the first to fling herself forward, before the vicar had even finished his blessing, to wrap her arms around them both at once. "Now you are truly mine," she said, muffled against Eleanor's skirts, "and I am truly yours, and no storm can ever take either of us away again." Eleanor knelt to gather the child close, her new husband's hand warm and steady at her back, the whole grey sweep of the cliffs and the sea visible through the chapel's open door beyond, calm now under a sky gone soft with spring light. She thought of the wheel that had broken on that road a year before, of the small cold hand she had caught and held, of every careful frightened step that had led her from a mending woman's cottage to this chapel, this family, this life she had never once let herself imagine wanting. "No storm," she agreed, and found that she believed it entirely, "will ever take either of you from me again." Outside, the sea went on breaking gently against the rocks below the cliff road, the same rocks that had so nearly claimed a child's life a year past, and now stood only as the quiet, ordinary backdrop to an ordinary Tuesday, in a village that had, in its own small way, witnessed something it would speak of for years to come, not merely a rescue. Though that had been remarkable enough in its moment, but the slower, harder-won miracle of a broken heart mended, a lonely house filled again with laughter, and a woman who had asked for nothing finding, in the end, that she had been given everything,